points in time, but it's our pleasure to have you here in the Venn, a room that's named for its design. It's designed as an intersection of other rooms where many separate things go on. If you're a guest to this space, you may not know what those many things are. If you're a student, you may be in some of them, but you may aspire to some. We have our magazine class from the Review. We have the student lounge. We have OTR on the Record, where we host our multimodal daily news enterprise. And this is a space, as you know, where many things go on all the time. Lots of different things, and it's forever changing, and yet its purpose stays the same. This is a room where people come together to meet and to exchange ideas, or at least it should be. Because in a world today that faces many challenges that divide us, having more places where people come to meet and share and consider possibilities for change is paramount. Thank you for being here in the School of Journalism at the Creative School of Toronto Metropolitan University. It is our great pleasure to host this event in a space where we gather in the Dish with One Spoon territory. This, as many of you know, is an area jointly honored by the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee in a wampum. A wampum is a treaty that describes how land can be shared to the benefit of all of its inhabitants through mutual cooperation and respect. As guests on these lands, I welcome you to reflect on and share in the spirit of peace and friendship that we have been shown as we travel through these lands. Through these teachings, I would also ask you to further imagine and acknowledge our power as storytellers, and honestly and openly question what we can all do through the relations we inform and influence with our journalism, because that's important. Honoring and taking into action what we do is the step that we need to take, not simply knowing it so that we can say that we do. As chair of the school, I am thrilled today that we are hosting the inaugural Al Hamilton Lecture that features Alia Davidson as our speaker. In a moment, my colleague Sherry Okeke will tell us a bit more about our speaker. So for my part, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about this lecture, how it came about, what it was for, and what it reflects as a part of our overarching goals as a school to recognize that we are not where we should be today, but where we want to be going, towards a goal of contributing to how journalism must become a more equitable public space and a more inclusive profession. This lecture was made possible by the generosity of the Second Chance Scholarship Foundation. The Second Chance Scholarship Foundation is a Canadian charity focused on helping at-risk youth achieve their highest potential through education, mentoring, and social responsibility programs. Second Chance strives to provide support to young people to help them overcome barriers they have faced and gives them access to opportunities to pursue their dreams. In addition to supporting this lecture, they have established the Al Hamilton Award in Journalism, which we have been honored to award to an undergraduate student for the last several years. When I sat at the award ceremony this fall, however, I was at a table with Rick Gosling, who was one of Al Hamilton's friends, and one of the proponents, the major proponent for this particular award, but primarily for this lecture, because his goal was not simply, let's make sure that we provide funds for an award for a student. Let's think about this in terms of what was Al doing and what was his goal, which was thinking about how we amplify this opportunity and this responsibility across society. It was clear that despite the value and the impact of the award itself, and despite the COVID delays and the challenges in scheduling that have made most public events afterwards been difficult to do, the goal was to honor Al Hamilton and to amplify his life's work as a champion of journalism and of the Black community and Black journalists in particular. As we all know, journalism is not experienced equally across communities. Black, Indigenous, and many other non-dominant groups are too often left out of the conversation, spoken about or for or to, and often in violent ways or to violent ends. That has consequences for us all as a society. That is not something that we should accept as inevitable. Al Hamilton knew this and was a trailblazing leader in journalism and the publishing industry at a time of extreme racial inequity in the Canadian media space. We'll hear a little bit more about that today, but he started in 1969 when he founded Contrast newspaper. Despite being more of a publisher and a business person than a journalist, Al described it as Toronto's first major publication serving the Black community. Contrast was described as the eyes and ears and the voice of Canada's Black community and was one of the first spaces that emerging Black journalists could go to build their work experience and speak about issues that affected them. The Second Chance Scholarship Foundation created the Al Hamilton Award in Journalism and really focused on the lecture as an opportunity to support the next generation of Black journalists and storytellers like Al, to see themselves and to choose to build a career in this dynamic and exciting industry. Going back to the teachings that inform the wampum of this land, it is through the sharing of this story and the continuous sharing of these stories of possibility that these things can start to come to life. If we look forward with intention and we continue to ensure that Al Hamilton's legacy carries on, we can ensure, as a group of people interested in journalism, as a group of people who recognize the continuing and valued importance of journalism for everyone, that journalism must be as inclusive as our society should be as well. We shouldn't accept that this is how far we've gone. We should always push the boundaries to make it more. So I'd like to call upon the stage Sherry Okeke, my colleague, to introduce our speaker.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to see such a full room and so many familiar and fresh faces as well. Thank you for being here. Despite all my years in broadcast, I'm shaking right now, but I want to make it clear that it's not from nerves. I'm not nervous. I'm just so excited. This is such a profound moment for me, personally and professionally, to be able to introduce our speaker. And I could talk to you about her for hours, but I want to save as much time for her as possible. So I'm going to try to keep it brief. So who is Alia Davidson? What do you need to know about Alia Davidson? So much. First of all, when I moved to Toronto 2 years ago, she was the first person I wanted to meet on a personal level. But professionally, she is executive producer of The Fifth Estate. The Fifth Estate being the flagship investigative documentary program on CBC. And this is a time when I would argue that investigative journalism is more important than ever. So Alia is a decision maker and a leader in Canadian journalism, and everyone should know her name. Now, she earned that job after years and years of hard work, a combination of talent and extensive experience. She's a documentary producer, she's an investigative journalist, she's an international journalist. I urge all of you journalism students to do extra research on Alia afterwards. You'll be amazed at all that she's been able to accomplish. She's been recognized by the industry, by the community, through many awards. And just to name a few, Emmy Awards with an S, okay? RTDNA, Canadian Screen Awards. She is incredibly accomplished. And her interest in journalism started at least as young as 13 years old. 13 years old, she founded a newspaper at her middle school in Mississauga, which is amazing. And so many of my students worry about where are they going to get where they want to go. Well, Alia didn't even go straight into journalism school when it came time for university. Instead, she decided to study cultural studies and world religions at McGill University. So that's her undergraduate degree. When it came time for a master's degree, when she wanted to go further, she went to London, England, and she got her master's degree in journalism. So Alia is more accomplished than I can ever express in this introduction, but one of the things I respect most about Alia is that she is a mentor. As she has been rising and accomplishing so much, she is always looking back and helping pull up the next generation of journalists. Alia does this in formal settings, but she also does it in informal settings. I know this because I've sent people to go talk to Alia, and Alia doesn't say no. So that is something that matters so much to me, both personally and professionally. So yes, in 2023, Alia became the first Black person ever to lead the Fifth Estate. And as a Black journalist myself with 25 years in the industry, I have to say I have mixed feelings about that. Because when we look at what Al Hamilton accomplished and what many others accomplished before him and after him, it kind of stings that the first executive producer, Black executive producer of the Fifth Estate was only recognized in 2023. That hurts. But Change is slow, but it's happening. Change is happening. And I cannot help but smile when I think of Alia in that role. The moment I heard that Alia was going to be leading the Fifth Estate, all I felt was joy, pride, and hope. Hope for the future of the industry, because I know the type of work that Alia does, and I know how she's mentoring the next generation while she's doing that work. So I'm thrilled to introduce you to the executive producer of the Fifth Estate and our Al Hamilton lecturer, Alia Davidson.
Yeah, okay. Is it on? Okay. Yes? Okay, there we go. Great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here, colleagues, professors, guests, and especially TMU students. Thank you for that generous intro, Sherry. That was too much. I'm thrilled to be here today to give the inaugural Al Hamilton lecture, and thank you to TMU J School for having me. It truly, truly is an honor. In preparing for this lecture, I spoke with many of my elders, role models, journalists, thinkers, and writers who came out of Contrast. All of us in this room owe them immensely. I want to thank them for their time, for their trust, for their candor, especially Aita Sadhu, Cecil Foster, Jojo Chinto, Hamlin Grange, and Royson James, who's actually here somewhere today. So if you get a chance to speak to him, please do. There he is. Hi, Royson. Thank you for coming. As Sherry mentioned, I am the executive producer of CBC News' flagship investigative show, The Fifth Estate. The Fifth Estate is about to enter its 50th season, which is a rarity in television, and as noted on the poster for this event, I am indeed the first Black person to hold that role. I'm also the fourth woman. I shouldn't be the first, and we shouldn't be having firsts, and I don't plan on being the last either. It has taken too long for the qualifications and contributions of racialized journalists to be recognized. I am one of the few Black or racialized people to have ever worked at The Fifth or at CTV's recently canceled investigative show W5 in its 58 years, where I was a producer and a senior producer. That I'm even here is due in large part to Contrast, but there need to be more of us. And investigative journalism needs everyone in order to live up to its promise. Without strong investigative outlets, we are poorer as a society and a democracy. Power goes unchecked. Al Hamilton definitely knew a thing or two about speaking truth to power. But on first look, my career and Al Hamilton's could not be more different. He was born in Edmonton and lived in Winnipeg and Regina, worked as a railcar porter, and then in various other legalish pursuits, depending on who you ask. He was incarcerated before founding Contrast newspaper, the eyes, ears, and voice of the community, in 1969. He was inspired by his work selling ads at an Italian paper in Toronto. I am a Jamaican immigrant, and spare some misguided years where I thought I might be a doctor, I have always wanted to be a journalist, and I have been fortunate to work exclusively as one. Al served, spoke directly to and for the Black diaspora, filling the gaping holes left by the mainstream of the day. Contrast pushed the envelope of what it meant to cover truth, what it meant to be objective. I have spent my career in that mainstream media he often took to task. But like Al Hamilton, as you heard, I didn't go to TMU. And like Al, my entry into Canadian journalism was slightly circuitous. I didn't go to J School in Canada at all, as Sherry mentioned. And there was a time when working in this industry and in this country felt impossible for me. When Al Hamilton founded Contrast with the Honorable Olivia Babsey-Grange, who would later become Jamaica's culture minister, Black people, lowercase b at the time, made up only 0.2% of the population, around 33,000 people. When Contrast opened, some might have argued that there wasn't a need for a paper like that served such a specific segment of the population. But how wrong they would have been. It just so happens that between 1971 and 1991, immigration policy reforms meant that skills and workforce needs overtook ethnic origin, i.e. European ancestry preferences. The Black community's growth exploded along with Contrast. By the time it closed in 1991, There were more than 500,000 Black people here, and in case you're curious, there are 1.5 million of us today. The first issue of the paper was published on February 9th, 1969, and its front page was about the Sir George Williams University, now Concordia University, student protest and occupation, the largest student occupation in Canadian history. The roots of that occupation can be traced back to 6 Caribbean students who accused their professor of discrimination. This is Al Hamilton in 1972. You can see on the screens, 3 years into running Contrast, photographed by the legendary Boris Spremo for the Toronto Star. He looks to me exactly as described, ever-present pipe, sharp dresser, showman, gregarious. He also willed the paper's success through relentless hard work. He saw the paper's potential audience explode and met the moment with all the buzzwords we hear today: specificity, point of view, relevance. But running a niche community paper alongside 4 robust daily newspapers in Toronto, there were 4 at the time, all fighting for a share of advertising, probably felt like an impossible task. That is something I relate to, and I'll bet many of you do too. The show I run confronts legally sensitive, high-risk subject matter every week, and we are doing it in a broadcast environment that is changing rapidly. But every week, we roll the boulder up the hill. Part of what drew me to journalism was I didn't always see myself and my lived reality reflected in the mainstream media. What does an expression like racially charged even mean, for example? I grew up in the suburbs in a thoroughly middle-class neighborhood with professional parents, both TMU grads, whose first language was English. So I knew if I felt underrepresented, it was likely much worse for others. I wanted to help reflect the world as it is, to tell the truth. I don't think I knew about titles like executive producer when I was a kid, but somehow I knew I wanted and needed to be part of big decisions, bigger than individual stories. Investigative journalism has allowed me to do all those things. And my pitch to you, students today, is this: consider my path as one you can replicate. Investigative journalism is the work of making the impossible possible, and that is what Contrast did. Contrast also filled a need to be seen, I am talking about. Here we have, as you can see in the caption, a Jamaican teacher and her students visiting Contrast in 1980. Contrast was in the heart of the Bloor and Bathurst corridor, 28 Lennox. Visited it recently with Royce and James. It's a condo now. And as you can see in this picture, it was a place and a paper that helped young people feel seen. The area was home to Black artists, writers, bookstores, thriving businesses. A newspaper visit is a fairly run-of-the-mill field trip, but to visit a newspaper staffed entirely by people who look like you and understand your life? I wonder what happened to the kids on this trip who'd be in their 50s now. What sparks were lit by that visit? Contrast was an incubator for Black journalists at a time when mainstream media was reluctant to hire racialized people at all. Impossible. We were spoken about in the third person, a them, not an us, as Canadians. I spoke to author and former Contrast editor Professor Cecil Foster recently, and he told me about how he sees that the paper was always investigative because, by the very nature who was doing it, the assumptions that were made about me, the assumptions I had to deal with when I interviewed people, the kind of research I might have been interested in, there's always an investigation. Investigation is interrogating the society and the basic assumptions that are there. Contrast expanded how we can understand this field, this craft of journalism. And I invite all of you to see yourselves on the continuum of journalistic evolution, from Frederick Douglass's The North Star to Marianne Shadd Carey's The Provincial Freeman, to Contrast, to whatever it is you will need to build in order to do this work. And when I say build, I mean restructure existing institutions or create the new thing that you need to see. To investigate is to think expansively and hopefully, to reach for a revelation. Hope is essential in investigative journalism, to shine that light and to form and sustain something like Contrast. Several people have told me it was more than a paper. It was a community center, it was a hub where ideas were formed and debated, where everyday Black people could walk in, talk about things they had experienced and seen, and know that they would be believed and listened to. Many of you will know some of the names who were associated with Contrast, those I named earlier, and also Harold Hoyt, Cameron Bailey, Arnold August, Diane Liverpool, Austin Clark, and again I'll mention Hamlin Grange because he's here now. Hi Hamlin, thanks for coming. Racialized journalists working in media today all owe a debt to Contrast. to those people and to the truths they revealed about our world and our industry. All of these people went on to influence. Many had been firsts or onlys in their journalism programs, some of them at this school. Many were first in mainstream newsrooms, which opened the door for me to have the job that I have now. Al was strident in making sure that happened. I've now heard many, many stories about him going to the offices of the Globe or the Star and taking them to task for their lack of inclusion. And though it seems counterintuitive to try to convince others to hire your top talent, Al didn't see it that way. As Royce and James told me, Al knew he could always replace writers if they fanned out. The community never lacked talent, it lacked opportunity. Like me, some of you may come from families that have no connections to media, be newer Canadians, all of the above, a lack of access and opportunity. And for all the growth in racialized populations, where are the racialized investigative journalists? We are here, but there should be more. I have some theories, but I want to first add a request to my pitch that you pursue investigative journalism. I've said you should consider it, but why? Because investigative enterprise journalism needs you. If not you, then who will tell the stories that only you can see? And if those stories aren't told, how close can we as a field really get to that old adage of telling the truth? While it may feel impossible, there's that word again, at this time of cuts and media consolidation, this actually means we need you more. There are stories waiting to be brought into the world by you with all of the unique life experiences and perspectives you bring. And in this era of cuts, there truly may not be someone else willing or available to pick up that issue you know needs a look. The pitch for Contrast's existence is similar to what you are facing now. Again, Al Hamilton was an ex-convict, a salesman, a hustler. He wasn't the sort of business magnate that normally founds or runs a paper. And his official title was publisher, but he was involved and he had a point of view. It was not just a business. As former editor Hamlin Grange told me, it was a just cause, one that Al believed in and that this industry sorely needed. In 1969, we were easy to ignore, to overlook, to make assumptions about. By the time Contrast closed, much had changed, but the biggest change was that Black people, racialized people, working class people, immigrants' position and portrayal in media had changed. The work of Contrast was to reveal a developing and changing community, first to itself and also to others. What is investigative journalism if not revealing? I've heard Contrast described in several ways: activist, Pan-Africanist, radical, but never investigative. But to me, it was by its very nature. I took a dive into the CBC archives to learn everything I could about Al, or Alfie, as those close to him called him, and one thing was consistent. He was dedicated to education and to pushing his colleagues in the mainstream press to do better. I'm about to play a clip of Al speaking to CBC News in 1980 as part of a longer series of programs about racism in Canada. This segment is about the school system and the media. And I know there was drama earlier, so I hope this plays.
Education is the only way to really fight racism and try I think that the various boroughs and I think the Board of Education has made a step in that direction. They realize there is a problem and they're trying to correct it by having courses in the schools and things of this nature. It seems that they are improving and they're certainly more aware of the minorities, visible minorities. They're doing more things on them. It's not satisfactory yet. I believe that a lot of the reporting about minorities is negative reporting. It's only on occasions where something has, someone's been beat up or conflicts, etc. I don't think they've really gotten into the covering special events or things that would perhaps show the community in a very different light. I think that that's coming. Certainly hope it is. I've spoke to editors of some of the mainstream newspapers, and they assure us that that is their intention of treating minorities just like everyone else, not setting us aside.
Again, look at the fits, sharp dresser. Treating racialized people just like everyone else. This is a through line for Al. We are no more, no less than anyone else. At work, in life, in commerce. He often struggled to get advertisers for the paper, and selling the paper to advertisers was his primary preoccupation each week. His great frustration was that the big box stores of the day that were popular with West Indian immigrants refused to advertise in contrast. Each week, Al would say things like, "I guess black people don't drink beer," or "Don't they know black people buy clothes?" But he would begin anew each week, resolute and realist, and roll the boulder up the hill. He focused on his skills and what he had, not what he didn't. He knew how to market. He was a salesman. Discrimination be damned. If there weren't enough ads, then the paper was shorter that week. But the paper was always there, ready to be read and to be passed around. Official circulation numbers made Contrast a tiny community paper, about 29,000 at its height. But it was passed around. It was discussed. Everyone knew what was in Contrast somehow, whether they had actually read a copy or not. And at times, Contrast had dueling editorials, often to do with policing, with the Toronto Sun, a paper that was bigger, better funded, more widely circulated. But again, tiny Contrast was held up at Queen's Park, at City Council. It was a paper with real influence. Because it was honest, it revealed ideas, events, and points of view that others did not. The lesson here, of course, is that to investigate, to reveal, to push requires immense fortitude. You have to be resolute. But if you have something, whether a story, a skill, or an idea, it is possible for it to make an impact. If you think something has value, it likely does. It doesn't matter if someone else has more this or more that. What matters is your commitment to see it through. When I talk about influence and importance, I have to note that Contrast crossed borders. Again, tiny paper. See the clicker. Can you go next, please, Ravi?
Education is the only way to.
Thank you. Tiny circulation, tens of thousands. This is Al meeting Jamaican Prime Minister Michael Manley in 1980. Jamaicans were among the first black immigration wave in the 50s and 60s, and were hard to ignore. Contrast was passed around and discussed as seen as part of the American black radical movement as well. So again, we have the publisher of a tiny paper meeting a prime minister. Who could imagine such a thing? And here in Canada, Contrast was how the mainstream media attempted to really grapple with and understand, or at least observe, a growing community. This article is from the September 21st, 1979 edition of the Toronto Star, and it has a very vintage headline: "Who Speaks for Blacks?" What a headline. Who are these people? What do we make of them? You have some now legendary names in Black Canadian organizing and thought quoted here. You see Dudley Laws, Bromley Armstrong, Dr. Wilson Head, Al Mercury, Charlie Roach, and Al Hamilton. A piece like this is also trying clumsily to reveal something, to have a conversation that the work these activists were pushing for. Without them, and without Contrast, it would rest on assumption. Again, the world needs your voice. I'm going to focus on Al's section. Here we see a few things stated as fact: that Contrast was controversial, angry, but also diverse. And we have Al speaking directly to the work of the paper. Being pro-black does not make us anti-white. We do everything we can to be positive. Contrast was concerned with revealing the truth, not attacking anyone. Revealing, giving context. It was in the black radical tradition of openly pushing back against harmful systems, for sure, but that's not inherently negative. I'm about to play a segment from 1972 called Blacks in Toronto. We love saying blacks. Al and then editor Stan Grizel, who was a civil rights leader and later a citizenship judge who would receive the Order of Canada, break down for a mainstream audience what the views and conditions of black people in Canada, specifically new West Indian immigrants, what their views were on the Black Power movement in the US, and that yes, discrimination was not an American phenomenon.
The publisher of Contrast is Al Hamilton. Associate editor is Stan Grizel.
Oh, black power to me means black improvement, black betterment, black dignity. I feel that all these things constitute black power.
I would say that the militancy of the black revolution will be determined by the response of the establishment to the fight of black people for their rights. I would say that there's discrimination to be found in every institution in this country. I think that we feel that there's less discrimination than there is in the United States, as is often pointed out, but I think that what is a fact is that we have so few black people in this country that it hasn't been given the publicity.
How do you feel about West Indians' reaction to discrimination in Toronto? Do you think that they're sitting tight on the thing, that they don't want to offend people by complaining about it, or what?
No, I would say that West Indians are leaders in this respect, a great many of them. They're not used to this type of treatment. They come up here and they expect to be treated as anyone else, a great many of them, and they find that they're in a society that doesn't accept them. They're not as, for instance, they find they're being treated like what they hear the American Negro or American Black is treated.
Remember, Contrast was only a few years old at this point, and it had already distinguished itself as a thought leader on a national stage. And without the hard, impossible-feeling work of publishing this paper, of hearing people's concerns, putting them in print, what might this segment have looked like? As Jojo Chinto recently told me, Contrast was first for us, and then also for showing other people who we are. Again, if you don't do it, who will? Contrast was criticized, often by The Sun, as being anti-police because of frequent editorials and reporting, sharing stories of brutality that the mainstream did not cover in the same way. But as they saw it, they were pro-community, and the community was under assault. People would come in the door saying they'd been beaten up, and many writers themselves got picked up. Who would tell these stories if not Contrast? I'm going to show you 2 clips around policing involving Al and one contemporary one, because to me, they exist on a continuum. First, some context. In 1978, Andrew Buddy Evans, who was black, was killed by a Toronto police officer at a nightclub in Toronto. A coroner's inquest found no wrongdoing. Then in 1979, a black man named Albert Johnson was shot and killed in his home by 2 police officers. They were charged with manslaughter. This is a CBC The National story from that time. So again, this is a news item from 1979, so it's a little long.
Two Toronto police officers were charged with manslaughter today in a case that has caused unprecedented controversy about the way the force is doing its job. The 2 were charged in connection with the shooting and the killing last month of a black man named Albert Johnson. It's an incident that has led to charges of racism against the city force and an investigation by the provincial force. Sheldon Turcott reports.
The 2 constables, 35-year-old William Inglis and Waller Kennelly, age 23, were released on bail but suspended from the force with pay pending the outcome of the manslaughter charge, which could carry a term of life in prison. In court, Ontario's Assistant Deputy Attorney General said the Crown's case would be based on the allegation that Johnson's death was unlawful because of an unlawful entry into his house. Rod McLeod said he found no evidence that the shooting of the Jamaican immigrant was racially motivated. McLeod also said news reports, which quoted witnesses as saying that police had made Johnson kneel on the floor before he was shot, do not fairly reflect the evidence. Johnson's widow, Lamona, was at the court hearing and was represented by lawyer David Martin, who criticized McLeod for making the statement about kneeling, saying it was inappropriate and should have been saved for trial. The publisher of a weekly newspaper says the charges justify the protests and outrage of Toronto's black community.
Personally, I'm pleased that there are charges. I think that it vindicates many of the people who have said that there are extenuating circumstances in this case and that it isn't your average police shooting. And I think that those people are courageous for being able to stand up in circumstances such as these.
But Toronto police are worried about the effect on morale.
Would have to be very concerned that it may just sink morale that much lower. Morale really took somewhat of a beating. Since this incident, we definitely had a morale problem. Now I'd be very concerned that that problem may worsen.
The shooting death of Albert Johnson in his home was the 8th by police in the past year. Johnson was the 2nd black man to die in that time. The case against the 2 officers will not affect the black community's drive for reforms in police hiring regulations, the Police Commission, and a Citizens Complaint Bureau. Sheldon Turcott, CBC News, Toronto.
So a few things stand out about that report. First of all, I think if any of you turned in a news pack this long, your profs would give you a really hard time and be like, try again. That was 3 minutes and 20 seconds. I think a tight 2 would have been fine. But in all seriousness, Al was so clear in his opinion, and in the chilling banality of that phrase, this wasn't your average police shooting. He was calling a thing, that people should not be killed in their homes. And that reference you hear to news reports that Johnson was kneeling when he was killed, it's about contrast and what they reported. They led the agenda on how news was covered on this story. Al is juxtaposed with a voice for the police, Mel Connolly, which is the correct thing to do if you're looking at the police and the public they serve as sides. It strikes me that the police's concern was morale on the force because of these charges. They were really bummed out, all these charges for shooting people. To hear that as the primary concern, but also to have it presented so plainly in a national newscast is striking. Al's comments that those protesting these conditions are courageous stand out even more in the face of an institutional line like that. It would have been easier and safer to not push back. Again, this is a newspaper publisher. He's looking for advertisers. But again, he was doing the hopeful thing of believing something else was possible. Those officers were acquitted the following year in 1980. We find ourselves in 1980 in this next clip about the push in Toronto for what is now called the SIU. Specifically, Al and others are reacting to an uprising in Liberty City, Miami, that was triggered by a court case in which an unarmed black insurance salesman was beaten to death by 4 police officers. The officers were subsequently found not guilty by an all-white jury, resulting in protesting and rioting by the black community in Miami and elsewhere. This CBC report is grappling with whether similar riots are possible in Toronto, given that wake of consecutive police shootings and acquittals.
I think they're anxious to see a police citizen complaint bill that they can live with, and I don't believe that that's Bill 47 in its present form.
I think that we may have a better handle on the situation, and we don't have the explosive mix that they do, that many of the southern states have at the present time.
I haven't got the foggiest idea what this community or how they may feel about a thing like that. I would just hope that the people in this city will act responsibly.
We have our problems here, and I think that the police and everyone else involved realize that we do have problems here, and I think that Toronto must be aware that something like that could eventually happen in this city. It just means that we must be more, we should learn from the Miami experience. I'm one of those kind of people that say, if I'm attacked, I will fight back.
If I'm attacked, I will fight back. Remember, again, Al was the publisher of a paper. They missupered him as editor, but he was the publisher. This is a fairly extraordinary quote for that role. He's running a business and talking about how he will respond if attacked, especially for that time. But it's also a fair comment given what he was faced with. He and his own journalists were harassed and profiled and had a front row seat to how the community felt and was being treated as well. We think of this now as opinion or something for a column, but to Al, it was reasonable and it was factual. He, in contrast, had done the work to speak with authority. And that's what investigative journalism does. It points to conclusions, to things in need of change. It reveals things that are not functioning as they could. You can do those things. You can make those calls if you do the work. The idea of there being justification in fighting back, of not automatically accepting reports from any official source as fact, especially institutional sources, those are changes that are still happening in journalism. All of you have a front row seat to that right now, in what and how you are being taught versus what your professors and instructors would have learned about bias, objectivity, and sourcing. And now, I will show you a short clip from a story that I think is on that continuum with contrast of questioning official premises and official lines, which is another thing investigative does. It's a recent documentary from a CBC show called The Fifth Estate. This item ran last fall and is called Who's Police? Critics and many in Indigenous communities say a controversial RCMP unit in BC at Fairy Creek in Wet'suwet'en called KERG acts as a private security force for resource companies and not for public safety. Leaked documents show industry leaders provided direction to RCMP bosses. These are serious allegations, and we reported them with every bit of seriousness required. That piece from The National in 1979 was very concerned with giving every view equal weight and equal credibility, in spite of obvious contradictions and conflicts. I want you to watch this clip of TMU grad and newest Fifth Estate host Stephen D'Souza as he interviews the head of CERG about allegations made by a whistleblower who left the task force.
They're anxious.
Conflict with CERG has gained international attention, from the United Nations to human rights groups like Amnesty International.
As someone who is new to Canada, it's alarming to have that kind of constant policing and the militarization process happening on Indigenous land.
Malak Gebrselassie is preparing a report on human rights issues in Wet'suwet'en territory.
But this one is like really a shock in many ways for us to see a separate branch of a police force actually engaging with Indigenous communities in such a way. It's just unacceptable to see this level of violence.
That violence led one CERG member to speak out. Obtained through access to information, the Fifth Estate has details why a 13-year veteran of the RCMP walked away from CERG. While stationed in Fairy Creek, he says officers described smashing windows of abandoned cars, confiscating protesters' personal property, and how he was told to drive those they arrested to a town an hour and a half away just to make it harder for them to return. Holding someone in custody to make things more inconvenient and driving them down the highway when they are to be released without charges is not justifiable. The officer says against directions, CERG officers would chat and joke with industry workers and security about the fucking hippies. He said they were ordered to remove their name tags and given thin blue line patches instead. We were told blue line patches piss off the hippies, so wear them. What do you say when one of your own officers is expressing concerns about the behavior of CERG?
Yes, I'm leaving you on a cliffhanger. You can watch that entire episode on the Fifth Estate's YouTube channel or on CBC's streaming service, GEM. That's the Al salesperson in me, always be closing. Go ahead and watch. But seriously, if not for that access to information request that showed us the officer's claims, we, journalists, we, society, would not have this additional context to add to the official record, which was, of course, that procedures were being followed and that everything was fine. The reveal in this scene and the way in which Stephen is able to hold police accountable is because of that investigative work, that pushing and that challenging of the official narrative in the way that Contrast did. But I know it isn't all changed laws and changed lives. Investigative work is expensive and difficult to sustain. Following the recent cancellation of CTV's W5, the Fifth Estate is now one of only 2 national long-form investigative TV programs in Canada. The other is APTN Investigates. And Al eventually sold the paper to Denham Jolly, who sold to Horace Gooden, who in 1991 had to close Contrast.
The conflict with
Contrast says advertising budgets are smaller, and that squeezed the paper's cash flow. This current cessation of publication doesn't mean the end of the paper, however. Contrast's publisher says he hopes to restart the paper in late spring, pending an upswing in the economy.
The tough economic times are just about to come to an end. Probably in June or so, we should start to see an upswing, and I guess sometime before that, we will be looking at reestablishing the newspaper.
Tough economic times have now hit the paper's staff. 10 full-time employees have been laid off. A skeleton staff of 3 will remain on the job. While the publication's suspended, Contrast will review who owes it money and who it owes money to. And the publisher says he's still hopeful that publication will resume.
We're committed to this community, and this newspaper is my commitment, and somewhere or another they're going to have it.
Here you see some B-roll of final editions of the paper of the office before it closed. There's no sound on it for some reason. We couldn't figure out why. All said, I'm not naive in thinking that what I'm asking you to do to follow in the footsteps of Al and Contrast editors and writers is easy. Layoffs, budget cuts, not to mention the polarized and volatile world in which we journalists work. But if there is something you are curious about that you want to dig into, that you want to reveal, shouldn't you? You are faced with obstacles, but you also have tools and education and a voice. There's excellent subscriber work on Substack, for example, some of it that sustains writers who publish there, and podcasts allow journalists to work and connect in an intimate, personal way, like Contrast. I think of work like The Africas versus America, and yes, it's a coincidence that that's a CBC podcast. Stream it now. It was hosted, written, and produced by Matthew Amha, who graduated from this journalism program in 2018. Part of what worked so well was because of the life experience he and others brought to it. It was branded as true crime, investigative, it's historical, it's personal. I knew about the Move bombing, which is the primary event in the podcast, but I hadn't ever heard it broken out like this. Matthew was young in his career, but he felt this story was important and fought and brought it into the world. If you think something is important, it probably is. That belief will help drive you. Again, there's nothing about Al Hamilton that says he should have had any business co-founding a newspaper, an ex-con, a black man in Canada in the 60s who did not have any formal credentials. And yet, there he was, and now here we are. By the time Contrast closed, other papers had already grown out of it whose founders had passed through, notably Share, Dawn, Daily Nation in Barbados. So it's gone, but not all the way. Its influence lives on. I have a paraphrased quote from carceral abolitionist and writer Mariam Kaba written on the whiteboard in my office. It reads, "We must choose the discipline of hope over the ease of cynicism. Hope is not flowers and wishes and waiting for our field to improve or for it to be more equitable in how it tells stories and about whom. Hope is pushing and believing, but also working so that we as an industry can be better, more reflective, more honest. Cynicism, on the other hand, is easy. It's lazy. It's not the gritty hard work of building something. You all are at the very beginning of everything, with every right to build something, to change something, a startup, a story, a career that looks how you want it to. As I've said, everyone I spoke to told me Al was a salesman, a showman, a hustler. He made something from nothing to fund that paper and get ads every week. He was creative. That's the thing about journalism, especially investigative. The work is never done, because with each story where you peel back the layers and you continue to find more and more and more, then you find the next story and the next. Investigative journalism needs you and your talents, and it will ask a lot of you. But that relentlessness is also what makes it worthwhile. It's never the same, and you rarely end up where you thought you might. When corruption and wrongdoing are revealed, it's possible for them to be corrected. If Al Hamilton and Stan Grizel did not have the paper that gave them that platform to comment on what West Indian immigrants really thought of Canada, would those views have made it onto a national platform? How would outrage at police killings have been captured? Who would have pushed the mainstream papers to honor their duty to include all Canadians in their staff and in their coverage? Of course, others did all those things too. But how would it look had Al opted out, sold cars? Had Contrast, which was at one time the feeder for Black journalists into the mainstream, not existed? So I'll ask you one last time. If not you, then who? When I asked journalist Hamlin Grange, who's right here in the front, Hamlin, what he thought Al, the showman, the salesman, the lecturer, the hustler, might make of all of this, a lecture series in his honor, and a scholarship, the Al Hamilton Award, at Toronto Metropolitan University, Mr. Grange told me that Al would be tickled and would probably say, "Yeah, I deserve it. I work for this. I worked hard to make this happen." Thank you.
Alia, thank you so much for what a wonderful weaving together of a variety of histories. And I think importantly, particularly from the student standpoint, thinking about and this is me asking you to think in your mind about a question so that you can propose a question of your own. But thinking about the idea that I'm in television, this is newspapers, but really the core is these are the stories that should be told, and there are lots of different forms and lots of different formats. Don't get caught up on that part. Get caught up on the why, and the how will play itself out in different ways. I think that's wonderful because as for students, it allows you to think about what is the core paradigm, what is the way of thinking, what is the way of engaging, and what is the ethical orientation I have towards how these stories become a part of the world in a meaningful way, because they must, but because this is what draws me here, and the how can be lots of different things. So I would welcome an opportunity for students, for guests, for members of the faculty who are assembled. If anybody has a question
Should I go back
for
up?
Alia, please.
Okay.
If anybody has a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you. There's a mic at the back as well. Please, there's a mic coming to you from back.
Okay, yeah, it's turned on. Thank you for speaking to us today. Really appreciate it. It's great to have you here. My question was about contrast, in a sense. I was wondering, do you think it's more effective as a way to educate the public? Actually, I wrote it down, sorry. Do you think journalism concerning Black people is more effective in educating its public when it's privately owned by the concerned parties, like Contrast, or when it's part of a larger, more widespread publisher, like the CBC?
I think it's both. Again, Black people are not a monolith, certainly not today, and also not at the time of Contrast. So to have Black-owned community voice, extremely important, extremely essential. However, Black people are part of people generally. So we should have Black papers and Black stories, and we should have Black people in every story and in every space. I think it's both, because we are full citizens and we should be everywhere.
Thank you.
Not all at once.
Thank you. I just want to add to that question and to your answer to it.
Please introduce yourself. This is Hamlin Grange, everybody. Former Contrast editor.
I think yes, Alia, there's room for both. However, I'll say this, that Contrast and publications like Contrast and media like Contrast, we don't play by the same rules. We're not restrained by the same rules that, let's say, the CBC, the public broadcaster, or the Toronto Star, which I worked for, along with Royce and James, or the Globe and Mail. We can tell a different kind of truth. It doesn't mean that that truth is any less objective. It just means that we're looking through it through a different end of this telescope. So is there room for a contrast or like that still today? Absolutely. Who will have the courage to do it? That's the big question.
100%. Agree. Thank you.
Hello. I'm in the investigative journalism class here at TMU right now, and we talk a lot about ethically covering communities that you are like an outsider. And I was wondering if you have any advice on how to do that, how to support like giving a platform to marginalized communities.
For sure. I'm glad you're learning about ways to do this work. Investigative does have a history of being incredibly extractive in the way that it does stories, and that's something we're working actively to correct. Certainly at my show we are. It's not perfect. I think the first thing is that you have to forget your deadline and really figure out what actually matters to the people you're talking to and who you will be working with. They're your partners in revealing the story. Do not go in with assumptions and having decided what the story is or decide what the concern is. Be genuinely curious to find that out and be willing to abandon what you thought you were going to do in the process of that. And I'd say also to really bring cultural competency to the way you approach communities. Do your research, figure out the best way to approach how much time you should take. Coming in hot with an interview request right off the bat, often not going to generally result in a good interview anyway. But you have to really spend time and build genuine trust and a relationship. It's a two-way relationship.
Hi there. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I have a question about when a journalist investigates an indiscretion and kind of digs into that and then reports on it, what is our responsibility afterwards, after it's exposed and people know that there's something that's going on, especially when dealing with like institutions of power? What do we do after we report?
I'd say keep following your story. I think you're maybe asking about, well, I'll ask you what you're asking about. Do you mean sort of in terms of the subjects, do we have a responsibility to them, or to, say, the issue itself? The issue itself, then keep reporting. Like, there are very, very few stories that are one and done. I just spent 45 minutes talking about these police shooting stories, for example. There are ways to continue going back, looking at what has changed. We did this big report, everyone freaked out and said they were going to change these laws or do these things. Did they? Go back and follow and see what actually happened. I think at that point you have to think outside of the box, and the sameness is the problem in a story like that, the fact that they are all so similar, and really, really be creative and push the envelope. For the school shooting example in particular, I think of the Washington Post, the Blast Effect series that they published last spring, which you all probably studied, or if you haven't, please look into it, where they waited for, it was a very involved graphic treatment, graphic in both senses, looking at what an AR-15 does to a child's body, because that's the primary weapon used in these shootings. And me as a journalist, I looked at it and said, this took months and months and months to put together, if not years, to package. They knew they were waiting for the next shooting and that they could publish it then because there would be one. And I think that in itself said everything about the issue. It said all there was to say.
Hi.
Hi.
On top of your head, if you could, do you think you can name like a quote of Al Hamilton that you think about on a daily basis?
On a daily basis? I think it's probably the one I ended on. This idea that he was not looking for outside validation. He had this idea that, yes, I work hard and this paper deserves the platform that it has. Like, I does this, as the kids say, that he really had that confidence and was not looking for anyone to give him anything, and he was self-motivated. I think about that a lot. He didn't really say, I does this, guys. That was a paraphrase, by the way.
Perhaps as a way of concluding, unless there are other questions. Oh, there's a question.
Just talking about how you mentioned that like this was, Contrast wasn't necessarily supposed to be as successful as it was, or it wasn't like necessarily like that's like a linear path. How do we as like the next generation as journalists, who you also mentioned, like we need now more than ever because jobs are decreasing and the industry is becoming smaller. How do we kind of prioritize building up our own independent like media sources and outlets, and how do we like kind of force our way in so that like the bigger guys can see that like we are still important and our voices do matter, even though we don't have the money or funds to back us up just yet?
Mm-hmm. I think it comes back to like Contrast just doing the work, which sounds like an oversimplification, but it's not. Excellent investigation, excellent publication, those cannot be ignored, frankly. And I can think of many, sorry, the buzzing. I can think, is that me? I can think of many examples of independent Substack publications, Sam Cooper's newsletter, for example, that the mainstream look at those, I tell you, and we follow those, we're aware of those. And I think the point is to maintain your own rigor, have your own standards, and do excellent work while you were trying to build something. Again, he did not have a business loan from RBC to start Contrast. He manifested Contrast in a creative way, let's say. And you have to think creatively. We all do as journalists have to think creatively now as well.
So as a way of concluding and also as by way of invitation, we have a brief reception afterwards. One of the elements that I think is necessary when we think about the idea of a reception is that it is relational in a way that Mr. Grange described the idea that objectivity, balance, proportionality of coverage, all of those things live in a space, but relational ways of doing journalism feels like a contradiction in some ways, and in other ways it's absolutely necessary to think about that as a different approach. Can you imagine the idea of what you're talking about in that space of this is a different way of journalism as opposed to these are different people who are doing the same thing?
Mm-hmm. It comes back to exactly what you said, relationality. I know when my team or when I approach a story, we're very aware of the perceived power dynamic between us and a source or us and a subject, and we seek to flatten that because it's not that we're doing them a favor or we need something from them. We need whistleblowers, we need sources, or this work doesn't happen. So it is a two-way conversation where, we maintain editorial independence, but it's an ongoing, this is the context in which I'm reporting you. This is how the quotes are gonna look. This is what I'm doing. Does this fit with what your experience is? Rather than, again, just grabbing your interview, you decide what they meant and publishing that, which I think was the practice for a very long time and still is a lot of places.
And thank everybody for coming today. Alia Davidson has been an extraordinary inaugural speaker, and you've done well to weave together the histories of Al Hamilton, but also your own examples, and shown us some deep archival footage that we might not otherwise have seen. We really, really fully appreciate your generosity of being here and sharing this story, but also inspiring students as well as everybody assembled to think about how this is not a thing you know and then you move on, but a thing you know to seed what you can do as you move forward through these professions and through these spaces. So please join me again in thanking our speaker, and please stick around for the reception afterwards and meet and say hello.
Thank you.
so
And
much.
again, the Fifth Estate, Fridays at 9 on CBC. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So I want to give anyone who wants to stick around for the reception a chance to do so, and then